Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff. Welcome to the last chapter of the semester. This is chapter 11. So let us begin now with where we are in the nervous system. So your textbook calls this nervous system part 2. So let us begin. Here we are, and keeping in mind the central nervous system consists of both the brain and spinal cord. As the brain has been described, it's been described as a ball of neurons. It's that largest and most complex part of the nervous system. So what it does is it takes care of many aspects of physiology, meaning it takes in things such as sensation, perception, movement, and thinking. It controls, of course, everything about homeostasis by the hypothalamus. So the brain includes two paired cerebral hemispheres, the Diencephalon, the brainstem, and cerebellum. We'll continue to those a little later in the chapter. So the brain contains about 100 billion multipolar neurons, as well as countless branches of axons by which these neurons communicate with each other and with neurons elsewhere in the nervous system. So typical of which is the areas of the nervous system that contain most neuron cell bodies appear gray, called gray matter, and those areas that contain myelinated axons appear white, called white matter. So both the brain and spinal cord have gray and white matter, and the brain, it is that outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebellum that are by and large gray matter. The white matter represents those interconnecting axons, and it is found deeper within the islands of gray matter throughout. And the spinal cord, it contrasts with gray matter, meaning those cell bodies of neurons, found more centrally, and the white matter is found on the peripheral and consists of axons that extend up into the brain or down from the brain. Since that brain connects the spinal cord to the brainstem, those axons conducting impulses up to the brain are bundled in ascending tracks. So those conducting impulses down through the spinal cord are in descending tracks. So both the brain and spinal cord connect to the peripheral nervous system via those peripheral nerves. So we have bones, also membranes, and the fluid that surrounds organs of the central nervous system. The brain lies in what is called the cranial cavity of the skull. So with that, I say in the spinal cord that occupies the vertebral canal and in the vertebral column. So beneath each of these bony coverings are membranes called meninges. They're located between the bone and soft tissues of the nervous system. They protect the brain and spinal cord. So I'll call those meninges to be three connective tissue membranes that lie just external to the central nervous system organs. So further in function, those meninges cover and protect the central nervous system. They protect blood vessels and enclose venous sinuses. They contain cerebrospinal fluid and form partitions in the skull. So with that, let us begin with the meninges. The meninges. So there are three layers. They're called the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is that outer, that leathery, tough, and the strongest meat, the strongest layer. So where it surrounds the brain, it is two-layered with a fibrous connective tissue. The more superficial, or the periosteal layer, attaches to the inner surface of the skull, the periosteum, and there is no dural periosteal layer surrounding our spinal cord. The deeper meningeal layer forms the true external covering of the brain and continues caudally in the vertebral canal as the spinal dura mater. So the brain's two dural layers are fused together except in certain areas where they separate to enclose the dural venous sinuses. So those collect blood from the brain and direct it into the interjugular veins of the neck. So next up, after finishing the dura mater, just keep in mind that it's made of tough, white, dense connective tissue, and it contains many blood vessels and nerves. I'll now move on to further with the dura mater. So with it, the dura mater continues into the vertebral canal as a strong tubular sheath that surrounds the spinal cord. It is attached to the cord at regular intervals by a band of pia mater that extends the length of the spinal cord on either side. The dural sheath extends as a closed sac at the level of the second sacral vertebra below the tip of the spinal cord. So the sheath around the spinal cord is not attached directly to the vertebrae, but is separated by an epidural space, which lies between the dural sheath and the bony walls. This space contains blood vessels, loose connective tissue, as well as adipose that pad our spinal cord. To foreshadow a bit, I'm getting to your test. On the test, what I'll ask about, of course, are injuries, particularly class injuries to the brain. I'll continue now. A blow to the head may rupture some blood vessels associated with the brain, and escaping blood may collect beneath the dura mater. If this happens, that would be called a subdural hematoma. This condition can increase pressure between the rigid bones of the skull and the soft tissue of the brain. Unless the accumulating blood is promptly removed, compression of the brain may lead to functional losses or even death. So keeping that in mind, I'll pair that with further traumatic brain injuries, and you will see this on your lecture exam. In other words, head injuries are the leading cause of accidental death in North America. Consider, for example, what happens if you forget to fasten your seatbelt and then rear end another car. Your head is moving and then stops suddenly as it hits the windshield. Brain damage is caused not only by localized injury at the site of the blow, but also by the ricocheting effect as the brain hits the opposite end of the skull. Please pay close attention, class. A concussion. This is an alteration of the brain function, usually temporary and following a blow to the head. A victim may be dizzy or lose consciousness. Although typically mild and short-lived, even seemingly mild concussions can be damaging, and multiple concussions over time produce cumulative damage. I'm doing this because I know that on the test, you all will be asked questions, and the questions will deal with this continuum of traumatic brain injury. I'll continue on with this continuum. Next up, a more serious concussion can bruise the brain and cause permanent neurological damage. In this condition, it's called a contusion. In cortical contusions, the individual may remain conscious. Severe brainstem contusions always cause a coma, lasting from hours to a lifetime because of injury to the reticular activating system. That's RAS. Pay close attention. Following a head injury, death may result from subdural, as I just mentioned, or even a subarachnoid hemorrhage. This is bleeding from ruptured vessels into those spaces. Individuals who are initially lucid and then begin to deteriorate neurologically are, in all probability, hemorrhaging intracranially. So it's that intracranial hemorrhage. Blood accumulating in the skull increases intracranial pressure and compresses brain tissue. If the pressure forces the brainstem inferiorly through the foramen magnum, control of blood pressure, that's 1, heart rate, 2, and respiration, 3, is lost. Pay close attention. Intracranial hemorrhages are treated by surgically removing the hematoma, which is a localized blood mass, and repairing the ruptured vessels. Class, this is very important information. The last on the continuum. Another consequence of traumatic brain head injury is cerebral edema, also known as class swelling of the brain. At best, cerebral edema aggravates the injury. At worst, it can be fatal in and of itself. Class, take care of yourselves. If you're driving, wear a seatbelt. If your significant other is hitting you, that's not love. It can kill you. Next up, the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid is that middle meat. So this forms a loose brain covering, never dipping into the sulci at the cerebral surface. It is separated from the dura mater by narrow serous cavity called the subdural space, which contains a film of fluid. Beneath the arachnoid membrane is a wide subarachnoid space. The spiderweb-like extensions span this space and secure the arachnoid mater to the underlying pia mater. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid and also contains the largest blood vessels serving the brain. Because the arachnoid mater is fine and elastic, these blood vessels are poorly protected. With that being stated, this web-like membrane does not have blood vessels and is located between the dura and pia maters. So it spreads over the brain and spinal cord, but does not again dip into the grooves and depressions. Keep in mind that the subarachnoid space between the arachnoid and pia maters contains the clear, watery cerebrospinal fluid. So the subarachnoid space of the meninges completely surrounds the brain and spinal cord. So these organs, in effect, float in cerebrospinal fluid. The fluid protects the brain and spinal cord by absorbing forces that might otherwise jar and damage delicate tissues. Make sure you all see Clinical Application 11.1, which we'll discuss where I just was, called Traumatic Brain Injury. It is so important to have cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions. Lastly, the pia mater. The pia mater, meaning that gentle mother, is composed of delicate connective tissue and is richly invested with tiny blood vessels. It is the only layer that clings tightly to the brain, like plastic wrap. It follows every convolution of the brain. Smaller arteries entering the brain tissue carry ragged sheets of pia mater inward with them for short distances. So it contains many nerves as well, and the blood vessels it contains also nourishes the underlying cells of the brain and spinal cord. So here I'll get to what is called meningitis. It is inflammation class of the meninges. It is a serious threat to the brain because either a bacterial or viral meningitis may spread to the central nervous system. So brain inflammation, which is different, it's called encephalitis. So with that, meningitis is usually diagnosed by obtaining a sample of cerebrospinal fluid via a lumbar tap and examining it for microbes. So usually, I say again, it's caused by a bacterial or viral infection, and it affects the arachnoid and pia maters, and sometimes the dura mater, and it's mostly found in children. Complications of meningitis include visual loss, hearing loss, paralysis, and intellectual disability. Meningitis may very well be fatal. Children are vaccinated against Haemophilus influenza type B, which was once the most common cause of meningitis. Class, as I do this, please make sure you take your notes and take your notes well. I shall now continue. So we've now gotten to what is called our traumatic brain injury, but before such, let's get to the cerebrospinal fluid and those four ventricles. Cerebrospinal fluid is found in and around the brain and spinal cord, and it forms a liquid cushion that gives buoyancy to the central nervous system structures while floating the jelly-like brain, so that cerebrospinal fluid effectively reduces the brain weight by 97%, and it prevents the delicate brain from crushing under its own weight. Cerebrospinal fluid also protects the brain and spinal cord from blows and other trauma. Additionally, although the brain has a rich blood supply, cerebrospinal fluid helps nourish the brain, and there is some evidence that it carries chemical signals such as hormones and sleep and appetite-inducing molecules from one part of the brain to another. So we call this cerebrospinal fluid a broth. It's similar to the composition of blood plasma from which it is formed. However, it contains less protein than plasma. Its ion concentrations are different too. For example, the cerebrospinal fluid contains more sodium, chloride, as well as hydrogen ions. So there are more sodium ions, more chloride ions, and more hydrogen ions than does blood plasma contain. And it has less calcium ions and less potassium ions. So it happens by way of the choroid plexuses. So the choroid plexuses that hang from the roof of each ventricles form cerebrospinal fluid. So it's those plexuses that are shaped like a frond that are responsible for the production of the CSF. And it happens then by a layer of ependymal cells which line the ventricles. So the capillaries are fairly permeable and the tissue fluid filters continuously from the bloodstream. However, the choroid plexus ependymal cells are joined by tight junctions, and they have ion pumps that allow them to modify the filtrate by actively transporting certain ions across the membranes into the cerebrospinal fluid. So the careful regulation of the cerebrospinal fluid composition is important because cerebrospinal fluid mixes with the extracellular fluid bathing neurons and influences the composition of this fluid. So ion pumping also sets up ionic gradients. So let's go there now to what happens when things go wrong. So as things go wrong, it could be, I'll put it this bit in this. Cerebrospinal fluid is produced and drained at a constant rate. However, if something such as a tumor obstructs its circulation or drainage, the cerebrospinal fluid accumulates and exerts pressure on the brain. This condition is known as hydrocephalus, or water on the brain. In a newborn baby, hydrocephalus, meaning with hydrocephalus, the head enlarges because the skull bones have not yet fused. Thanks a lot, Fontanelles. That's why. That is the reason. However, in adults, the skull is rigid and hard, and hydrocephalus is likely to damage the brain because accumulating fluid compresses the blood vessels and crushes the soft nervous tissue. Hydrocephalus is treated by inserting a ventricular shunt, meaning a shunt into the ventricles to drain excess fluid into the abdominal cavity. The blood-brain barrier. So please keep up with me in your textbook class, and if I go too fast, just press pause, take your time, and then continue on. Just take a pause and then continue on. So I'll begin now with the blood-brain barrier here. The blood-brain barrier. So no other body tissue is so absolutely dependent on a constant internal environment. And I'm saying all of this because it mentions, of course, by way of our astrocytes, if you look closely on page 395, those astrocytes provide a barrier between the blood and the brain by way of the interstitial fluid. So please keep up with me, and if you're not with me, I'll give you time to get with me. In other body regions, the extracellular concentrations of hormones, amino acids, and ions are in a constant flux. They constantly change, particularly after eating or exercise. If the brain were exposed to such chemical variations, its neurons would fire uncontrollably because hormones and amino acids serve as neurotransmitters, and certain ions, particularly potassium, modify the threshold for neural firing. Please refer back to what we just did in the 10th chapter. That was a review there. The blood-brain barrier is the protective mechanism that helps maintain the brain's stable environment. So exceptionally impermeable, those tight junctions, which I just mentioned, which I just mentioned, between capillary and endothelial cells are its major component. Blood-borne substances in the brain's capillaries must pass through 3 layers before they reach the neurons. They pass through the endothelium of the capillary wall. Secondly, they pass through a relatively thick basal lamina that surrounds the external surface of the capillary. And then thirdly, the bulbous feet of astrocytes which cling to the capillaries. So the astrocytes play a role in regulation. They supply the required signals to the endothelial cells and cause them to make those tight junctions. So those tight junctions are sigmas, and they join those endothelial cells, making them the least permeable capillaries in the body. The blood-brain barrier is selective, not absolute, you all. This is important to know. Nutrients such as glucose, essential amino acids, and some electrolytes move passively by facilitated diffusion through those endothelial cell membranes. However, blood-borne metabolic wastes, hello, test questions. Blood-borne metabolic wastes, proteins, certain toxins, and most drugs are denied entry. Small non-essential amino acids and potassium ions not only are prevented from entering the brain, but are also actively pumped from the brain across the capillary endothelium. So, of course, what I'm saying now is the blood-brain barrier is ineffective against fats, fatty acids, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and other fat-soluble molecules that diffuse easily through all plasma membranes. That is basic review, class, from Biology 103. This explains why blood-borne alcohol, blood-borne nicotine, as well as anesthetics, class, can affect the brain. That is textbook 101, class. Learn this because you have to know it. The structure of the blood-brain barrier is not completely uniform. In some brain areas surrounding the 3rd and 4th ventricle, the barrier is entirely absent, and the capillary endothelium is quite permeable, allowing blood-borne molecules to easily access neural tissue. One such region is the vomiting center of the brainstem, which monitors blood for poisonous substances. Another is the hypothalamus, which regulates water balance, temperature, and many other metabolic activities. Hint, hint, the control center. Lack of a blood-brain barrier is essential. I repeat, lack of a blood-brain barrier here is essential to allow the hypothalamus to sample the chemical composition of the blood. The barrier is incomplete in newborn and premature infants, and potentially toxic substances can enter the central nervous system and cause problems not seen in adults. So, injury to the brain, whatever the cause, may result in a localized breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. And most likely, this breakdown reflects the change in some of the capillary endothelial cells or their tight junctions. Please remember that, class. You will see that on your test. So I'm now at the brain. So the brain contains centers for and performs the following functions. Neural centers for sensory function. Thanks a lot, Chapter 12. Sensations and perceptions. Thanks a lot, Chapter 12, meaning the special senses. Motor commands for, or at least to, the skeletal muscles. That reminds me, thanks a lot, motor division by way of our somatic nervous system and the effector there being skeletal muscle. Higher mental functions such as memory and reasoning. The neural centers for coordinating muscle movement, neural centers for regulating visceral activities, as well as overseeing the function of the entire body. And even, of course, our personality. It's all there in the brain. So major portions of the brain are there as follows: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and brain stem. I'll begin now with the structure of the cerebrum, class. I won't spend much here, class, on brain development. I will not spend much time here on brain development. I'll continue on. the cerebrum it is. So our cerebrum has been once called the executive suite of the brain. And I say it's called that because I would say it controls everything that you can think of about our brain in and of itself. If you're wondering what I mean, excuse me, I'm stating that the cerebral cortex, the cerebrum as it is, that executive suite, is because it's where we have our conscious mind. It enables us to be aware of ourselves and our sensations. It enables us to communicate. It enables us to remember, understand, and initiate those voluntary movements. So when you think of that cerebral hemisphere class, think of it as being our brain in and of itself. So we have those two large masses that make up our cerebrum called the cerebral hemispheres, as you all see there. And with that, we have terms. Terms such as the corpus callosum. It connects those cerebral hemispheres. We have what is called a gyrus. A gyrus is a ridge, so being plural, there are gyri. We have a sulcus. A sulcus is nothing more than a shallow groove, such as we have that central sulcus. And of course, to be plural, they're called sulci. And then we have what are known as fissures. So those are those deep grooves in the surface. We have those that are longitudinal fissures, as well as those that are transverse fissures. The longitudinal fissure is what separates us into having those two paired cerebral hemispheres. And the transverse fissure is what separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. It separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So now I'll get to those 5 lobes of our cerebral hemispheres. They are as follows. The frontal lobe, please place your hand there. The parietal lobe, please place your hands there. I said your hands, 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 thank you all. Up next, we have what is called the temporal lobe. Please place your index fingers there. We have the occipital lobe. Please place one hand there. And then finally, of course, the insular lobe. And that is that lobe that is deep within the lateral sulcus of each hemisphere. But of course, it's within such, so it's covered by parts of the frontal lobe. So with this, I'll continue on. So I've already gotten to the anatomy here. So I'll continue on with what I haven't gotten to, meaning the cerebral cortex and the higher mental functions. So with our cerebral cortex and its functional areas, we have our motor areas, our sensory areas, and our association areas. So what I'm getting at here is it interprets those impulses from our sensory organs, initiating voluntary movements. It stores information as memory. It retrieves that stored information, and of course allows us to reason and have that seat of intelligence with personality. I won't get into these very deeply because I can't ask everything on the test. However, what I will say is this is the reason that we are who we are, meaning our cerebral cortex. That seat of intelligence is just as stated there. And I can't say it any other way other than just saying it, meaning it's why a person is intelligent. It's why a person has that personality. It is why he or she reasons the way he reasons or the way she reasons. It is why you can retrieve information that is stored, such as how you drive home each and every day, or which is why you know how to spell your name, because of course it's stored in your memory and you can retrieve that information. So I now get to functions of our cerebral cortex a bit more specifically. So now I mentioned those functional areas. So those functional areas can be divided into the sensory, association, and motor areas. So each area contains a group of neurons work together and perform a particular function. So functional areas of the cortex. Let's begin. So first things first, we have that cutaneous sensory area. So sensory areas in several lobes of the cerebellum, in several areas, of the cerebrum, receive and interpret impulses from sensory receptors. They produce our feelings or sensations. For example, The sensations of temperature, touch, pressure, and pain in the skin arise from the post-central gyri of our parietal lobes. That's called the somatosensory cortex. It's called the somatosensory cortex. And this is posterior to the central sulcus, you all. The posterior parts of the occipital lobes receive visual input, the visual cortex, whereas the superior portions of the temporal lobes contain the centers for hearing, also known as the auditory cortex. The sensory areas for taste, the gustatory cortex, are near the basis of the lateral sulci and include part of the insula. The sense of smell arises from the centers deep in the temporal lobes. It is the olfactory cortex. So as I do this, and having this figure here, class, shown from the textbook, I hope this gives you a real insight, meaning figure 11.8a, into how this works. So sensory fibers from your peripheral nervous system, they cross over the spinal cord or the brainstem. Thus, centers in the right hemisphere interpret impulses originating from the left-hand side of the body, and vice versa. However, sensory areas that are concerned with vision receive impulses from both eyes, and those concerned with hearing receive impulses from both ears, which is how you're hearing my voice now, and how you're seeing, of course, the presentation. So next up, I'll get to the association areas of the cortex. So with this, association areas are neither primarily sensory or motor. So they connect with each other and with other brain structures. So the association areas occupy the anterior portions of the frontal lobes and are widespread in the lateral portions of the parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Association areas analyze and interpret sensory experiences and help provide memory, reasoning, verbalizing, judgment, and emotions. How amazing this is. So the association areas of the frontal lobes provide higher intellectual processes, such as you all now concentrating on this lecture. Also includes planning, meaning what you're about to do. Moreover, complex problem solving. All things I say I strive to have you all do in class each day, and of course on each test you take. The anterior and inferior portions of these lobes control emotional behavior and produce awareness of the possible consequences of behaviors. These abilities are also collectively called executive function. Our parietal lobes, they have association areas that help interpret sensory information, and they aid in understanding speech and choosing words to express your thoughts and feelings. So awareness of the form of objects, including one's own body parts, stem from the posterior regions of these parietal lobes. The association areas of the temporal lobes and regions at the posterior ends of the lateral sulci interpret complex sensory experiences, such as those needed to understand speech and to read. So these regions also store memories of visual scenes, the music you do indeed love, such as maybe a Stevie Wonder or a Miles Davis, or even old Kanye, and other complex sensory patterns. The occipital lobes have association areas that are adjacent to the visual centers. These are important in analyzing visual patterns and combining visual images with other sensory experiences, such as when one person recognizes another. So when you all see a classmate that you recognize, or when you all see myself, your teacher, Mr. Huff, that you maybe recognize, or anyone else on earth you may recognize, and you may not even remember their name, but you recognize them visually. The functions of the two lobes of insula are not as well known as those of the other lobes because their location is deep within the cerebrum, making them impossible to study with the surface electrodes. So association areas, they do often interact. So I say the area where occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes meet, they process sensory information from all three of these association areas. It plays a role in integrating visual, auditory, and other sensory information, and then interpreting a situation. The example is that you hear a familiar voice, you look up from your notes, and you see a friend from class, and you realize that it is time for your study group. How amazing this is. And not all brain areas are bilateral, meaning that at Wernicke's area, it's usually in the left hemisphere, in the temporal lobe adjacent to the parietal lobe. And this is near the posterior end of the lateral sulcus. And this area is important for understanding and formulating written and spoken language. So I'm saying all of this because this is important. And if you're wondering why I'm saying this is important, it is important to know that the insular area is here, and this is responsible for, I'll put as being appropriate emotional responses, such as feeling disgust at the sight of something unpleasant, or a feeling of joy when hearing music, or even biting into a slice of pizza, or a hamburger that's nice and juicy. Watch out for atherosclerosis by buying. So next I'll get to those motor areas of the cortex. The motor areas are as follows. So we have the motor areas called the primary motor areas, or the motor cortex of the cerebral cortex, and it lies in the pre-central gyri, or the frontal lobes. So with this, impulses from the pyramidal cells, they move down through the brainstem and into the spinal cord, and most nerve fibers in these tracts cross over from one side to the other side of the brain to others within the brainstem. So impulses conducted on these pathways in special patterns and frequencies are responsible for movements in skeletal muscles. So cells in the upper portion send impulses to the muscles in the thighs and legs, and those in the middle portion controls muscles in the arms and forearms, and those in the lower portion activate muscles in the head, face, and tongue. So as you look at the figure, the relative size you see here in figure what is called 11.9a and b, the size differences are there because, well, it's because how they interact. That's why there is a difference in size. So I'll continue on, and one thing I'll mention about figure 11.9, the motor area, it's that left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and it's for voluntary muscle only. Whereas the sensory area would be for cutaneous senses, with of course a left hemisphere and right hemisphere. So go back in where I was. So I will next get to the motor speech area, also known as Broca's area. I say Broca's area because this is the muscles that control speech, meaning the muscles needed for speech, period. So Broca's area is for generating the complex pattern of motor instructions for the muscular actions of the mouth, tongue, and larynx, which make our speech possible, you all. So Wernicke's area ensures that the communications make sense. And Broca's area provides the motor instructions for written or spoken communication. So it's those bundles of axons that directly and indirectly connect Broca's area with the Wernicke's area. So a person with an injury to Broca's area may be able to understand spoken words, but may be unable to speak. A person who has experienced damage to Wernicke's area could initiate speak, but without control of its content. Lastly, the frontal eye field. So this is above Broca's area, and it controls voluntary movements of the eyes and eyelids. So with this is how, meaning we can learn movements and patterns of the hands and fingers that make much skill, meaning your fingers, class, have amazing ability to write. And this is, of course, how it happens. Now I'll get very briefly to hemisphere dominance. So both cerebral hemispheres participate in basic functions such as receiving and analyzing sensory impulses, controlling skeletal muscles on opposite sides of the body, and storing memory. However, one side usually acts as the dominant hemisphere. In most people, the left hemisphere is dominant for the language-related activities of speech, writing, and reading. It is also dominant for complex intellectual functions requiring verbal, analytical, and computational skills. In other people, however, the right hemisphere is dominant, and some hemispheres are equally dominant. So with this, I'll move on down to memory. So with memory, this is, I say, one of the most amazing places I like to get to. And even sometimes I've been told that I should have done this portion of this lecture a lot earlier in the course, because it pretty much teaches students how they ought to attempt to learn information. So as we get into memory, I'll break it down and be quite blunt as far as what memory is. Memory, class, is nothing more than the storage and retrieval of information. That's all memory is, you all. So memories are essential for learning and incorporating our experiences into behavior and are part of a parcel of our consciousness. Stored somewhere in your 3 pounds of wrinkled brain are zip codes, the face of your grandfather and even grandmother, I say, and they, whoever he or she is, or whoever they are, I'm kidding, and even the taste of yesterday's pizza. Your memories, they do indeed reflect your lifetime. How amazing our memories are. So there are 3 different kinds of memory. I repeat, there are 3 different kinds of memory. On your test, I'll ask about... Yes, sure. On your test, when I ask about memory, I will ask about your procedural memory, your declarative memory. So that's facts. To memorize names, faces, words, and even dates. Up next is the procedural memory. So the declarative memory is facts. Now the procedural memory, skills, meaning memory of playing the piano even, or playing the drums as I do. Memory of riding a bike, however, is motor memory. I repeat, motor memory is such as riding a bike. And I'll lastly get to emotional memory, meaning your pounding heart when you hear a rattlesnake nearby. So declarative memory stores, and of course, the storage of declarative memory involves 2 distinct stages. I'll say again, facts, class, memory, names, faces, words, and dates. Declarative memory storage involves 2 distinct stages. They are as follows. And how it happens is it's called A, short-term memory, and B, long-term memory. Those are the 2 stages that it includes. Short-term memory is also known as working memory. It's that preliminary step, as well as the power that lets you look up a telephone number and dial it and then never think of it again. But I must come back down to earth and say, it's not 1990 anymore. So I guess you all don't look up many telephone numbers. Thanks a lot, cellular phones, smartphones, Apple and a Google or Android. Short-term memory is limited, class, to an approximate 7 or 8 chunks of information, such as the digits of a telephone number or the sequence of words in an elaborate sentence. I wish this were class. I'll give you all a telephone number right now. How about you try to remember it? 601-928-7165. If you have never heard that in your lives before, you would never, ever be able to recall that from memory. Because, of course, it's short-term memory. However, please don't call that number. That was a number to my house phone when I lived in Mississippi with my parents. So, to contrast, it's called long-term memory. So long-term memory seems to have, I say, limitless capacity. I say again, long-term memory Contrast that of short-term memory. You have it and it's gone. With long-term memory, it is limitless in capacity. In other words, it's amazing how I'm told, ha ha ha, Huff, it's too much information for me to learn. You're kidding yourself. It's here in the textbook. Your textbook says that you have a limitless capacity to store long-term memory. So although our short-term memory cannot recall numbers much longer than a telephone number, we can remember scores of telephone numbers by committing them to long-term memory. I'll tell you right now, there are some phone numbers I still remember right now because they're in my long-term memory. However, long-term memories can be forgotten. And so our memory bank continues to change with time. Furthermore, our ability to store and retrieve information declines class with age. You all are young by and large. This class, yes, it's a challenge, but I guarantee you, if you put your all into learning everything that you've been taught, you can definitely master the course and earn, I say, the highest grade you've had in a class before. Even if it is just another A, if you've been an A student in your entire educational career. So we do not remember or even consciously notice much of what is going on around us. As our sensory inputs flood our cerebral cortex, they are processed, and an approximate only 5% of this information is selected for transfer to short-term memory. And short-term memory still serves as that temporary holding bin for data that we may or may not want to retain. The information is then transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. How amazing it is. So many factors, class. This is where it gets good. Many factors, class, contribute and influence the transfer. So this is your key to doing well, not just in this class, but I say every class you ever take in your lives. I have a 4-piece for you. The first class is emotional state. We learn best when we are A, alert, class. We learn best when we are B, motivated. We learn best when we are C, class, surprised. We learn best, class, when we are D, aroused. For example, when we witness a shocking event, transfer is almost immediately, such as you seeing a tornado last night, or seeing, class, a hurricane last year, or this year, such as you seeing a car accident unfold before your eyes. It didn't involve you, but it was right there before your eyes. Norepinephrine, that neurotransmitter, is involved in memory processing of emotionally charged events and is released when we are excited or stressed out. It helps us, and it helps to explain this phenomenon. 2 of 4, rehearsal. I say it time and time again, the first day of class, I try to help you all out and say, hi, if you like to do well, please at least try this. Meaning, if you rehearse your notes, if you repeat your notes, this enhances memory. So once I, by some stroke of, I guess I'll say, chance, and I don't mean the rapper, when I began to rehearse my notes, it changed my entire trajectory for life. I told you the same story in the first day of class. Please try it. If you're not getting the outcome you'd like after that first test, try this. After the second test, please try this. But now, when the final exam ensues, if you've not tried this, I still recommend you try it. But of course, you've waited an entire semester. You can still do it. Up next, 3 of 4, association. Try to tie new information into old information that's already stored in long-term memory. So this appears to be important in remembering things called facts. So related to something you know, something you've already learned. 4th and finally, class, automatic memory. So not all impressions that become part of long-term memory are consciously formed. So it might just be that you, as a student, concentrating on my speech, may record an automatic memory of the pattern of my voice to tie that information in. So I just cannot stress enough. And the last thing is that memories transferred to long-term memory take time to become permanent. So this is called memory consolidation, and it involves fitting those new facts into categories of knowledge already stored in your cerebral cortex. So it's our hippocampus that surrounds the temporal cortical areas that play a major role into consolidating and communicating with the thalamus and prefrontal cortex. One thing that I will say is damage to the hippocampus and the surrounding medial temporal lobes structures on either side result in only slight memory loss. So bilateral destruction can cause widespread amnesia. So from here, I'll keep on moving, and we'll next get to what is called our basal nuclei. I'll make it quick. The basal nuclei, also called the basal ganglia, are masses of gray matter deep within the cerebral hemispheres. They include the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. It is the basal nuclei that produce the neurotransmitter dopamine. I repeat, dopamine. If it weren't an important class, it is so important now. So I say this because the neurons of the basal nuclei interact with other brain areas, including the motor cortex, the thalamus, and cerebellum. These interactions, through a combination of stimulation and inhibition, facilitate what is called voluntary movement. Let's see Parkinson's disease now. This, of course, is in which neurons of the basal nuclei degenerate. Make sure you read it. I'll be brief. It states, in Parkinson's disease, neurons degenerate in the substantia nigra, which produces the neurotransmitter dopamine. Yes, I said that. So even when Michael J. Fox, who was in his late 20s, meaning when his wife noticed the first sign of Parkinson's disease, when he leaned when walking, when one of his fingers began twitching, Fox consulted a physician, and so began the journey toward his diagnosis of one of approximately 6 million people worldwide who have Parkinson's disease. Only 10% develop symptoms before age 40, like Michael J. Fox did. And if you don't know Michael J. Fox, maybe you do know, of course, who was called Muhammad Ali. Professional boxers are at a higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease from repeated blows to the head. Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's disease for many years because of the many years of head injuries. In Parkinson's disease, I say again, the neurons degenerate of the substantia nigra area of the brainstem. It's that large black area. That's the name, substantia nigra. That dark pigment the neurons release is a byproduct of synthesizing the neuron dopamine. When these neurons degenerate, less dopamine reaches the synapses with the neurons in the striatum of the basal nuclei. And with that, the decrease in dopamine causes the motor symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Some patients develop other symptoms such as depression, dementia, constipation, incontinence, sleep problems, and even class orthostatic hypotension. And yes, I said orthostatic hypotension. In other words, class, it's dizziness upon standing. It happens, of course, in the elderly, but of course, it might not be, of course, Parkinson's disease related. I say please take more time to go through this to keep things, class, timely. I'm going to continue on. I'll now, class, get to what is called the Diencephalon. And if there was ever, class, a reason to go to your textbook, please make sure you take the time to go through where we are now at the Diencephalon. I'll continue. The Diencephalon. So the Diencephalon includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. So with this, it develops from the posterior forebrain and is located between the cerebral hemispheres, and it is superior to the brainstem. So in the Diencephalon, there's a dense mass called the thalamus. I did say it, the thalamus. So with the thalamus, what happens here is it has inputs that regulate the emotion and visceral function from the hypothalamus. It has instructions that help direct the activity of the motor cortices from the cerebellum and basal nuclei, and inputs from memory or sensory integration that are projected to the specific association areas. In summary, class, the thalamus plays a key role in mediating sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. In other words, you could call the thalamus the gateway to our cerebral cortex. So having done that, I'll just say it one more time. The thalamus relays that sensory information by synchronizing those action potentials. And it's all because the lateral geniculate nucleus and that region of the thalamus. So it sends those action potentials to a part of the visual cortex. So from here, I'll move it on and get to what is called the, I guess I'll go on down to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is named because its position, meaning it's below, below the thalamus. So the hypothalamus, it caps the brainstem and forms an inferolateral walls of the third ventricle. And then it merges with the midbrain inferiorly. So let us begin. If I were you, I would begin writing, class. I say again, if I were you, I would begin writing. Please begin writing. Despite its small size, the hypothalamus is the main, I repeat, the main visceral control center of the body. It is vitally important to all, I repeat, to all, vitally important to overall body homeostasis. Few tissues in the body escape its influence. Its chief homeostatic roles are two. Here we go. Control the autonomic nervous system. In case you haven't learned it yet, the autonomic nervous system, class, controls what is called smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. I'll do more with this next class. I'll do a whole lot more with this further divisions called the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So what I'm getting to is the autonomic nervous system, called sometimes the automatic nervous system, is a system of peripheral nerves that regulates, here we are, cardiac muscle and smooth muscle and secretion by the glands. The hypothalamus regulates autonomic nervous system activity by controlling the activity of the centers in the brainstem and spinal cord. In this role, the hypothalamus influences blood pressure, the rate and force of our heartbeat, digestive tract motility, eye pupil size, and many other visceral activities. If you're not writing now, class, I don't know why you are not. You have to know this for your test. Another homeostatic role would be to integrate physical responses to emotions. It is the hypothalamus that lies at the heart of the limbic system, meaning that emotional part of the brain. It contains nuclei involved in perceiving pleasure, yes indeed. Perceiving fear, oh boy, I almost got scared a second ago. In perceiving rage, as well as those involved in our biological rhythms and drives, such as our sex drive. And yes, that meant the circadian rhythms formerly. The hypothalamus acts through the autonomic nervous system pathways to initiate most physical expressions of emotion. For example, a fearful person has a pounding heart, high blood pressure, and pallor, sweating, and dry mouth. Thirdly, its chief homeostatic role is to regulate body temperature. The body's thermostat is in the hypothalamus. It is hypothalamic neurons that monitor blood temperature and receive input from other thermoreceptors in the brain and at the body periphery. Accordingly, the hypothalamus initiates cooling, i.e. sweating, or the heat-generating actions called shivering, as needed. A relatively constant body temperature. I mean, to maintain that relatively constant body temperature. It does maintain it. Up next. Fourthly, it regulates food intake in response to changing blood levels of certain nutrients, such as glucose and amino acids, or hormones, such as cholecystokinin. Yes, I said cholecystokinin. CCK, you all? Write it down. Remember it. And even ghrelin. And others. The hypothalamus regulates feelings of hunger and satiety. So yes, you should, class, stop eating at some point. Should, I say. I'll now continue. Fifthly, it regulates water balance and thirst. When bodily fluids become too concentrated, hypothalamic neurons called osmoreceptors are activated. Those osmoreceptors excite hypothalamic nuclei that trigger the release of the antidiuretic hormone. Keep this in mind. This will be on the test. It is ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, from our posterior pituitary. The antidiuretic hormone, called ADH, causes our kidneys to retain water, the reabsorption of water. And thereafter, your urine becomes more concentrated because, of course, the reabsorption of water. The same conditions also stimulate the hypothalamic neurons in the thirst center, causing us to feel thirsty and drink more fluids. 6. It regulates our sleep-wake cycles. It acts with other brain regions. The hypothalamus helps to regulate sleep. It's suprachiasmatic. I repeat, it's suprachiasmatic nucleus, a biological clock that sets the timing of the sleep cycle in response to daylight and darkness cues received from the visual pathways. And number 7, controlled endocrine system function. The hypothalamus acts, I repeat, our hypothalamus acts as the helmsman of the endocrine system in 2 important ways. It first, releasing and inhibiting hormones, control the secretion of hormones by the anterior pituitary gland, and secondly, its supraoptic and supraventricular nuclei produce the hormones ADH and oxytocin. So please, I hope you have this. If not, take time. I'm not done here. I will do a lot more here. So I say again, heart rate and arterial blood pressure. You should know all of this class for your test. Body temperature, water and electrolyte balance, control of hunger and body weight, control of movements of glandular secretions, and the stomach and intestines, production of neurosecretory substances that stimulate the pituitary gland to release hormones that regulate growth, control of various glands, and the influence of reproductive physiology, and sleep and wakefulness. So hypothalamic disturbances cause a number of disorders, including severe body wasting, obesity, sleep disturbances, dehydration, and even emotional imbalances. For example, the hypothalamus is implicated in failure to thrive, a condition characterized by a delay in growth or development that occurs when a child is deprived a warm and nurturing relationship. So if ever you have a child, or if you do have children in class, please provide him and or her with such. Otherwise, he or she may very well fail to thrive. Lastly, I'll be here with the epithalamus. And with the epithalamus, I'll say it helps to regulate sleep-wake cycles. So by way of doing such, it's the epithalamus that extends from the root of our third ventricle class, and extending from it is our pineal gland, or pineal body. The pineal gland is what secretes the hormone melatonin. It is a sleep-inducing signal and an antioxidant. So having done such here, class, I believe I will pause the lecture now. Well, instead of pause the lecture now, I think I may very well just keep on going in this lecture, because I see where I am, and I pretty well know where I'm going. So let's just keep on going, Huff. Up next, class, is the brainstem. On your test, I'll ask this question: what composes the brainstem? The brainstem is composed of the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. Let us begin, Huff. The midbrain. So as I am here at the midbrain, what I'll say about it, I'll keep it blunt, is the midbrain acts in reflexive responses to sound, such as the startle reflex, that causes you to turn your head toward an unexpected noise, such as that bump in the night that wakes you up, that you, of course, never expected to be there. Next up is the pons. And I'm doing this rather quickly. And I guess I'll go back to further information of the midbrain. I'll get to our reflex centers in just a moment. Let's go to the pons, as I said moments ago. So with the pons, it's that bulge you see, the bulging part of that stem between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata. So it's chiefly, of course, composed in conduction tracts. And with this, its other important pontine nuclei are part of the reticular formation, and it helps, I repeat, and it helps the medulla oblongata maintain the normal rhythm of breathing. This is the pons. And then finally, class, the medulla oblongata, and I'll spend most of my time here. So with this, the structures of the medulla oblongata, I won't test you on. What you will be tested on, class, are the functions. So to help you with this, it's our medulla oblongata that has these things called vital centers. I say again, our vital centers. I'll begin now. So with this, they're called reflex centers, meaning the small size of the medulla belies its crucial role as an autonomic reflex center involved in maintaining homeostasis. So it maintains these important functional groups of visceral motor nuclei. They are as follows. The cardiovascular center. This includes the cardiac center, which adjusts the force and rate of heart contraction to meet the body's needs. You should write this down. It's infinitely important to know. If it were not important, I would not teach it. So as I say this, the cardiac center, which adjusts the force and rate of heart contraction, it's here, and the reason that it is here is because the body must have the adjusted rate and force of contraction to meet the body's needs. So along with the cardiac center, which adjusts that force and rate of heart contraction, it's called the vasomotor center. And the vasomotor center is what changes blood vessel diameter, regulating blood pressure. It regulates blood pressure by way of the vasomotor center. Up next are the respiratory centers. The respiratory centers are what generate the respiratory rhythm, and in concert with the pontine centers, it controls the rate and depth of breathing. So there are various other centers that are here and included, such as those for vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. So I cannot stress enough that these reflex centers are important. Our cardiac center, which increases and decreases heart rate. The vasomotor center, which initiates impulses that affect smooth muscle in the walls of blood vessels and then stimulate them to contract, constricting the blood vessels, vasoconstriction, and thereby causing a rise in blood pressure. A decrease in the activity of these cells can produce the opposite effect, i.e. dilation of the blood vessels, vasodilation, and a consequent drop in blood pressure. And the respiratory center, which maintains the basic rhythm of breathing and works with other brainstem areas to adjust the rate and depth of breathing to meet changing needs. Hence, injuries, class, to this portion of the brainstem are often fatal. Class, please prepare well for your final exam. Study well. If you need me, class, let me know. We'll pick up class where we are here after the brainstem at what I called reticular formation. Thank you all for listening. This has been your instructor, Scholar Huff.